Sponsored by the James Madison Council and the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Welcome to the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. My name is Colleen Shogan, and I'm the director of the David Rubenstein Center for White House History at the White House Historical Association. And I'm here today with Julia Zweig and Karen Tumulty to talk about their respective books, Lady Bird Johnson, Hiding in Plain Sight, and The Triumph of Nancy Reagan. A reminder that the last 10 minutes of this interview is reserved for you, the viewers, to ask questions of our authors. You can start submitting questions now, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of our program. Welcome, Julie and Karen, to the 20th Annual National Book Festival.
Wonderful to be here with all of you.
Well, I wish we were in person, but we truly have a worldwide audience for this conversation, so let's get right to it. Several common themes are shared by your books. For example, Lady Bird Johnson and Nancy Reagan both suffered from popular misconceptions. How do your books reshape how we think of these women? Julie,
I'll
do you want to go first?
Sure. In almost every way, I guess, is the top line answer to your question. First of all, I'll speak of mine and Karen can speak to hers. Lady Bird Johnson left behind a massive record of her experience in the White House, 123 hours of what I call the other LBJ's other tapes. And these tapes are a document of her time, which shows very clearly her ambition, her significance, her influence, and her powerful role she played as what I think is the most significant and important member of the Johnson administration other than LBJ. That's the top line takeaway. And the book shows that on civil rights, it shows it on race, it shows it on the environment, it shows it on the entire arc and trajectory of LBJ's presidency, starting with a decision that was basically drawn up, a strategy by her in the beginning of 1964, that LBJ would not run again, and announced as much in March of 1968. We think of the Johnson presidency as one that came to a conclusion early because of Vietnam, because of domestic upheaval, because of challenges from within the party. All of that were major factors, of course, but they were each factors that the Johnsons anticipated right after they came into the White House, and that Lady Bird Johnson was instrumental in guiding her husband both to stay in the presidency in 1964 and run and win, and to exit in 1968.
Yeah, I was really struck in the 4.5 years of research that I did for this book, how, each of the women, and they've all been women so far who've filled the role of First Lady, has really had to sort of shape this job that comes with no job description, that comes with no mandate or no portfolio on her own, and to her own particular interests, the moment in history in which she finds herself, and the needs of the president. And in Nancy Reagan's case, I think I only wish she had left all those tapes. In fact, she preferred to leave no fingerprints at all. But she was incredibly influential, not only as truly, the only person in the world to whom Ronald Reagan was truly close. He was really a very solitary figure, but also the degree to which her strengths really complemented his weaknesses. And I think in particular, she had a much keener sense of the people around him even than he did. As James Baker, who was their first White House chief of staff, told me, she had incredible radar, much better than he did. So while she rarely set foot in the West Wing, if she was unhappy about something that was going on there, everybody knew it. People who were not in her good graces tended not to last for very long. But she was an incredible ally to people like George Shultz, the Secretary of State, Baker, the White House Chief of Staff, when she could be convinced that something was in Ronald Reagan's best interest. So I think that in the book, it makes a pretty solid case for the influence she had in a number of the Reagan administration's greatest successes. Chief of them, I think, would be the warming of relations with the Soviet Union, not something that people might have associated with Nancy Reagan. But again, from the interviewing I did, from the records I found, people I talked to like George Shultz, she was a very, very influential figure there. The other place where I think she was incredibly important was at the very lowest moment of her husband's presidency during the Iran-Contra scandal, where Nancy Reagan really was the only person in the White House who sort of remained clear-eyed enough to sort of put together the rescue effort.
There's a very short time difference between Lady Bird's time as First Lady in the White House and also Nancy Reagan's tenure. It's a little more than a decade between the two, but it seems to me that conceptions of women's role in American society changed dramatically during this time frame. So how did this affect Nancy Reagan's role as First Lady versus Lady Bird? Maybe Karen, you can start us off on this one.
Certainly. Well, I think what happened between the two of their tenures in the White House was the feminist movement. So I think Lady Bird was fitting a role that the public perception, at least, was very comfortable. She seemed very traditional. By the time Nancy Reagan came along, she was seen as some sort of throwback, to the mid-century illusion of the perfect helpmeet. It really, I think, in some ways, she was portrayed as almost a woman out of her time. And I think by the time she took the role, it was really much more tricky, I think, for a presidential spouse to navigate.
Listening to Karen, it's very interesting because Lady Bird was of a different generation than Nancy Reagan, and she was socialized to conceal her intelligence and conceal her power, and especially married to Lyndon Johnson, although it was very clear to both the East Wing and the West Wing how important she was, and Lyndon talked about it all the time. They had both a very traditional marriage, but in the same sense, quite a modern marriage, a disarmingly modern marriage, given in the extent to which she was such a participant in the joint economic, media, business, and then political enterprise of their career. But she actively concealed that in many ways, and at the same time was cognizant of her significance. One of the reasons why she became such a devoted record keeper, a compulsive documentarian of her own role. And so she had to navigate appearing, and of course this was an appearance, stuffing herself into a kind of two-dimensional political spouse role to the public while privately having, becoming the consummate strategist and multitasker in private.
How were each of these women viewed within the White House? Were they respected? Were they feared? Were they admired? All of the above? What was the conceptions of them within the confines of the White House?
Well, in Lady Bird's case...
Go ahead. Sorry, Julia.
In Lady Bird's case, Lyndon had quite a volatile personality, and his emotional range was pretty significant. He could be borderline abusive with his staff, not even borderline, just plain straight out abusive. And in the inner workings of the White House, Lady Bird was sought after time and again to kind of repair the damage. And she was, along with one other person who left his staff in 1964 and another woman, Liz Carpenter, who was a very key person that knit together the political operations between the East and West Wing. she was, Lady Bird, the only person that Lyndon truly trusted and who could speak to him and correct the sometimes damaging impact of his personality. She also, and I learned this in my interviews, and then especially since the book came out, was somebody who was understood to be, by his very senior staff people, incredibly important. And you see this, whereas Michelle Obama made a point in her memoir of saying that she only went into the White House, into the Oval Office, once during 8 years on the day of the Sandy Hook massacre in Connecticut. Lady Bird Johnson was in and out of the Oval Office all day long and passing messages back and forth to her husband. And, this jointness of the political operation, I think, was a signature of her and laid the groundwork for first ladies to come, was something that was recognized and regarded ultimately quite positively by their staffs. Some of the early staff members from the Kennedy team who stayed on were taken aback, in fact, by Lady Bird and Liz Carpenter's standing with Lyndon Johnson, and it took some time for them to get used to that, but in time they did.
I think people in the West Wing were terrified of Nancy Reagan. They knew, as I said, that people who were not in her good graces tended not to last very long in their jobs. And also you see example after example of people who didn't understand her power, didn't understand her influence, to their peril. I think chiefly would be White House Chief of Staff Don Regan in the second term, who at one point tells Nancy Reagan, if you have anything to say to me, you can talk to my deputy. And she says, Don, I really don't think we need an intermediary here. Mm-hmm. And certainly when during Iran-Contra, she decides that he has become an impediment to the president, she goes on a campaign to get rid of him and to persuade her very, very stubborn husband to do so. And again, ultimately, she is the one who wins that battle.
Both Lady Bird Johnson and Nancy Reagan led very successful policy initiatives as First Lady. Can you talk about each of these initiatives, both the successes they enjoyed and also the difficulties they encountered? Karen, maybe talk about, everybody associates Nancy Reagan with Just Say No. I remember when I was growing up, that's what I would have thought of with Nancy Reagan.
That's right. And, people these days tend to sort of roll their eyes at Just Say No, that it was just a slogan. And also, the darker side of it is that it was family-friendly cover for policies that incarcerate, the Reagan administration's official policies were to treat drug abuse as a criminal issue, a law and order issue, not as a health issue. But you had to understand Just Say No. Just Say No was really aimed at young children, elementary school age children. And you did see, with her leadership, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these Just Say No clubs starting up across the country. It seeps into the media culture. And if you look at data regarding young people's attitudes towards drugs in the 1980s, there's something called the Monitoring the Future Project, which is really the best source of this data. You really do see a real sea change in how young people viewed the acceptability of drug use. And from the 70s, when it was becoming very acceptable, to by the late 80s, early 90s, kids were saying, they wouldn't approve of their friends smoking marijuana. Then once Nancy Reagan is off the scene, these attitudes do shift back. But I think that, again, she was often criticized for this. And another thing that people don't recognize is how this project actually had a lot of resistance within the Reagan administration. At one point, she gives a speech at the United Nations where she takes out, after her husband's own administration, which has been trying to sort of pretend that drugs are a problem of supply and not demand. And she said, we cannot go after the campesino in Peru or the poppy grower in Afghanistan and not talk about the investment banker who's scoring some cocaine on his lunch hour. And afterward, a number of delegates of these countries who had found themselves bearing the brunt of the administration's pressure came up and thanked her for that. And George Shultz told me that there were a number of people who were really trying to sort of rein her in and pull her back, but she really did put a focus on the demand side of the drug problem.
And Julia, this plays a big part in your book, Beautification.
It does. And, beautification was the term that Lyndon's boys, as she referred to them, came up with to conceal as a euphemism for a much more ambitious environmentalism that Lady Bird possessed and that developed and evolved over the time in the White House. She was, the First Lady's office doesn't have its own budget. It can't put forward legislation. It's quite constrained. But what she was interested in doing, remember, in the early 1960s, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, comes out in 1962. Environmental consciousness, just as feminist consciousness is just beginning to percolate in the zeitgeist, is still inchoate. So Lady Bird's environmentalism at first is packaged as beautification, and she brings in philanthropists from New York, some quite aristocratic, some quite radical, to come to the White House to try to first focus on planting Washington, D.C. and making Washington, D.C. part of the City Beautiful movement and making it a model for the rest of the country. But she quickly sees that the ornamental side of beautification is going to be disparaged, and that given the extreme levels of inequality and along racial lines, especially in Washington, D.C., she had to go deeper. And what she tries to do over the course of the 5 years in the White House is really bring together civil rights and social justice and the idea that to be fully human, Americans need access to nature. And Americans and American cities, especially the most marginalized communities. We're coming off, when she comes into the White House, of a period of 15 years or so, and this resonates today, of massive investment in infrastructure in two ways. One, the interstate highway system, and two, urban renewal. And the impact of both in parts of the country, 300 cities around the country, and especially where urban renewal is bulldozing communities, and also where interstate highways, entrance and exits to cities is doing the same. There's a major critique among landscape architects and urban planners that we have to think more coherently about how federal dollars are spent so that the most vulnerable communities are not displaced and wind up in food deserts and these massive impossible towers that sprung up all over the country. That's the context for her of her environmentalism, and what she winds up trying to do with certain partners like the Secretary of Interior, Stu Udall, and the individual that became the first mayor of Washington, D.C., Walter Washington, with a very revolutionary landscape architect named Larry Halprin from San Francisco, is to make the area along the Anacostia River in Southwest and Northeast DC a place where desegregated access to nature with public resources for public recreation for those citizens of Washington who actually live in Anacostia would be funded and seen as a public good. Of course, to answer the second part of your question, and this would be a model for the country, she hoped, as domestic tumult and riots and political uprisings at home escalated, and as the war in Vietnam drained resources from domestic policies, she found that it was increasingly difficult to pick this up and make it a national program, let alone make manifest the Anacostia Project. But she was, I think, a total visionary because she understood the relationship between mental health and transportation and criminality and access to nature and access to food and education and literacy. It was really a pretty coherent vision she had for the environment, and one that I think clearly we're still wrestling with how to address as a country.
Now we're going to go to some questions from our viewers. Greg asks if you could both comment on the role of these two first ladies in public affairs after their time in the White House. Karen, can you start us off?
Absolutely. And I think that this also is a pretty pivotal part of my book, because what happens is very shortly after Ronald Reagan leaves office, he is incapacitated by Alzheimer's disease. And it really falls on Nancy Reagan's shoulders to become not only his physical caretaker, but also the caretaker, the shaper of his legacy, to make sure that it is something that is very, very true to him. And so you see her play a crucial role in the establishment of the library. She makes sure that his diaries, which are in his own hand, that a half century of his correspondence is published. She's also very, very suspicious, as you know, for a generation after Ronald Reagan leaves the scene, he continues to be a force who shapes Republican conservative politics. She is very, very suspicious of the ideologues who would stand up and sort of claim his mantle for whatever it was that they were interested in pushing. I was struck, for instance, at one point during the Gingrich Revolution, a number of the House Republicans mount an effort to replace FDR on the dime with a profile of Ronald Reagan. And interestingly enough, Nancy Reagan opposes this. She said, FDR was the president that my husband admired more than any other. He would not want to see him displaced on the dime. You know, again, I think she would do a lot of these things that people found surprising. And she also steps out on her own. She announces in 1994 that she is pro-choice. She comes up against the Republican establishment during the George W. Bush administration when she mounts a campaign in favor of stem cell research. I think for the first time, too, she is comfortable expressing her own opinions on some of these issues.
Julia?
Well, in Lady Bird's case, you know, Lyndon Johnson died in 1973, pointedly on the day that the Roe v. Wade ruling was issued by the Supreme Court. Lady Bird lived for another 30 plus years. She had a very long post-presidency, and I'm smiling at Karen's comments because there's some parallels here. Lady Bird began when they were in the White House and continued through its launch and until she died to be, but especially in her early years after the White House, she was very involved in creating the LBJ Library and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Her commitment to her understanding that it would take historians and the country as a whole many, many decades to have a full understanding of the Johnson presidency. She was aware from the get-go that Vietnam had made it almost impossible to fully appreciate what had happened on the domestic side. And so she spent, as I said before, a lot of time making sure that the institutional culture of the LBJ Library was one of transparency as great as possible. And first, in fact, it's she who makes the ultimate decision to release fully all of the LBJ tapes in 1993 and 1994. She's also in 1977, whereas she had never really embraced the word feminism or called herself a feminist, shows up at the 1977 National Conference on Women in Houston and joins Coretta Scott King and Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter and her own daughters and others, Bella Abzug on stage, and she tells the conference attendees, thousands of people, that she never thought of herself as the women's movement as for her, but she did now, and she basically embraces feminism. So she has her coming out, as it were, but she stays sort of, between the LBJ school and the library, and starting a major environmental center called the Wildflower Center, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, bringing to Austin the kind of water and trails and natural park system that she had hoped for in Anacostia. But her role gets a little bit smaller. She doesn't have quite the political activism that I think Nancy Reagan did. She focuses on her family and on Texas and on the legacy of what she ultimately did call our presidency.
The next question is one of my favorites. It's from Sarah. She asks, how do you think the role of a political spouse will shift when we have our country's first gentleman? Both of you are experts on first ladies. I would love to hear what you have to say to this. Karen?
Well, I don't think they'll get in trouble for buying expensive china and wearing expensive designer clothes. But I do think that a man in the job is going to have to find out the hard way what all these women in the job have found out, which again is that there is just no guidebook for this role. And also that when the word powerful is used to describe a presidential spouse, it's not usually intended as a compliment.
Yeah, but I would say also that the gender biases that are baked into our society will convey, in the sense that when a man is a first gentleman in the White House, to call that person powerful won't be as negative a statement as it is to call a woman in that role powerful. I think that the benefits of being male will confer to the first gentleman, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, it would have certainly been interesting to see Bill Clinton in that role had Hillary been elected, somebody who himself had been president. I had always wondered how he would have negotiated a White House where he used to be in the big job.
Karen, that sounds like that could be your next book. That's Our last question is from Patricia, and she asks, if you had to pick one single achievement for each of these women, what the most significant achievement, what would you pick? Julia, what would be the one single most significant achievement from Lady Bird Johnson?
I don't think that the Lyndon Johnson presidency would have been possible without her. The way that they came into office because of the assassination on November 22nd, 1963, coupled with LBJ's thin skin, insecurity, sense of illegitimacy, paranoia, all of the traits that he had, along with his ambition and his vision and his powerful capacity to get things done. Lady Bird was the person who, because she shared his ambition but didn't share his emotional instability, was able both to keep him focused on the objective at hand, get him to run, which he was seriously contemplating not doing in November of 1964, and then get him out. So I would say that 100% it's LBJ's presidency, both its most significant components on the domestic side, and also she shared the blinders that he did on Vietnam, but it's really the totality of that presidency which would not have been possible without her.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that was also the case. And I was told that over and over and over again as I was researching my book, that really Ronald Reagan would never have been governor of California, much less president of the United States, had he married someone else. But her strengths so complemented his weaknesses, and her understanding, her unique understanding of both his strengths and his weaknesses were really, really crucial both to his rise and to his success.
Karen and Julia, thank you so much for this terrific conversation this afternoon. Both of your books are excellent. They provided me with hours and hours of enjoyable summer reading, and I recommend them to all of our viewers here today. And thank you very much for our viewers for watching and listening, and we hope you enjoy the remainder of the 2021 Library of Congress National Book Festival. Keep enjoying the book festival at loc.gov/bookfest. Have a great afternoon.